She's Katie Montgomery. He's Justin Joseph. These best friends are serving subpoenas to bad advice weekly with Wrong Way Forward. Now, here's Katie and Justin.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Wrong Way Forward. Last week, we covered some hot topics and territory over a woman who gave up her kidney. We talked about people, what their car says about them. This week, we're taking on kind of a new topic, one that I think is something that most people can relate to, how you deal with aging parents.
And Justin, that is true. And unfortunately, I didn't get to the point where my parents were truly aging. I lost my mom when she was 64. I lost my dad when he was 73 and was still working full time. They were both kind of able-bodied, very healthy people. But being in middle age, I am hearing where people are starting to get very concerned about their parents. And it's interesting, we're seeing a lot of pushback from parents of like not wanting to downsize, not wanting to move into, kind of a residential assisted kind of living space. And what does that mean? So we do have a Dear Abby column, and we're going to see whether or not Abby gave good advice. The topic here is aging mother refuses to acknowledge risk of falling. So the person writes in and says, Dear Abby, I moved across the country 9 years ago to be closer to my parents as they age. They are now in their early to mid 80s. My mother has recently had a few falls. One was bad enough that she had to be taken by an ambulance to the ER because she was not able to stand. I suspect some of her falling is due to having a drink or two at the casino, which affects her balance. Let me just interrupt. I kind of love her mother already. I have been saying for almost a year that my mother needs a walker because it has fallen on deaf ears. I took it upon myself to buy her a walker and a shower chair. She and Dad are still convinced she doesn't need a walker. Abby, when we got to the hospital, she needed assistance to use the bathroom because she couldn't stand or walk on her own after the fall. Today I learned she and my dad went to the casino without the walker. I am beside myself. They are either in denial or just don't want to listen to me. But I'm at my wits' end because I'm sure this will happen again. I'm afraid her next fall may result in broken bones or worse. Any advice? Fearful daughter in Las Vegas. And so Abby writes back, Dear daughter, you may be trying to reason with the wrong parent. Assuming that they are both in their right minds, tell your father that with the history of falls that your mother has, the result of the next one could be serious. Neither of them is a spring chicken. If either one, particularly your mother, were to break a hip and be bedridden, it could lead to pneumonia or death. If they take light of it, get their doctor to weigh in. And that is all that Abby said. And so, Justin, Abby's advice, wrong way forward?
I think it is the wrong way forward. I mean, as a child, you have a right and a duty, I think, to get involved in something like this because it does come down. It will fall on her lap if this isn't addressed, right? And I also think when you're looking at your parents in a loving relationship, they're going to make decisions. I think they have a tendency to make decisions more from emotion than from logic because they are thinking about, things that you and I wouldn't be thinking about. That's my guess. So, yeah, I think that she can talk to the father, but she really needs to have a sit down with both of them and say, this is important to me because of X, Y, Z reasons. Mostly because I want you to be around for a long time, but also because, if you do have a fall, that's not just a fall. At that age, those falls are a domino effect to something much worse. Your thoughts?
Well, I think, first of all, Abby is completely wrong. I mean, just saying, you're no spring chicken and this can be worse. I think what someone's not doing is really showing true empathy and trying to put themselves into their parents' shoes. Mm-hmm. And I think denial is usually a way to cover fear.
Interesting.
And my guess is that there are a number of heavy emotions going on here. They're scared, they're insecure, they're humiliated. They're feeling maybe, and I've heard this with aging, it's the concept of mattering. Like, do you matter anymore? So they might be feeling insignificance, worthlessness, feeling inadequate. And so here is a parent that has always been the provider. They took care of you. And to kind of patronize and talk down to them and say, a fall can lead to a hospital stay, which can lead to pneumonia, which could lead to death. Again, as Abby said, if they're in their right mind, they know that, right? And so I think the idea is can you put yourself in their shoes and kind of understand what they're thinking and how they're feeling. And if you can understand where they're coming from, you might reframe what you're saying.
So you
Because
thought I was the wrong way forward as well.
yeah, because I think it's very interesting. I actually think my father would have been a horrible old person because he was athletic and well and
Yeah.
young at heart and very smart. And I think certain things slowing him down, he was a proud man and an active man. And I think rather than accepting it, reframing it, and owning it, I think he would have dug his heels in and
Yeah.
fought it. And I think
And
they
you
have
guys would have
this
fought. I mean, because you had no problem telling him.
probably. And I think I probably didn't have the right frame of mind to understand that this is somewhat an identity crisis. He's been the provider, he's been healthy, he's been well, he's been a business owner, he's been a physician. And then I probably also didn't think of what they called the slope theory, right? A slippery slope. You know, you tell me I need a walker, that immediately makes me think of a nursing home,
Yeah.
right? And so it's kind of baby steps. And so I think the question here is how do we reframe and instead say, I want you to be independent. I want you to go to the casino. I want you to live on your own. We can do that, and you can do that for a longer period of time if we implement these things, right? You can maintain your identity, you can maintain your independence. I think there would have been a better way to word this, and I think Abby was pretty flippant with it.
Yeah, I agree.
And here's the thing, too, that I think people forget is the dad. It like cracks me up. Like they're all living in Las Vegas, and they're just running over to the casino, having a few beverages, and playing. Dad doesn't want to lose
His drinking buddy.
his casino buddy. And you know what? He probably doesn't want to deal with a walker himself. And
100%.
and so, and again, he's probably in denial also because this is his significant other. And so I think saying go to the dad is not necessarily the right way forward either.
Yeah. Well, you know, we're dealing with this in my own family, and I want to be careful. It was funny because growing up, I watched my father care for my grandfather who was ailing. And like one story I remember him telling me is we were at a casino, and my grandfather who had Parkinson's was shaking at the casino pretty badly. And he was having trouble talking then. And my dad told the story that he leaned over to him and said, bourbon. And my dad didn't know what that meant. And then he realized that my grandfather wanted a bourbon and he wasn't allowed to drink, but my father got him one, and, and he stopped shaking. And, watching that, and then now my grandmother is in a nursing home and she's struggling. But my father also, my mom is starting to reel things in with him as well. Did I tell you they're moving out of Colorado?
No.
Yeah, they're putting their house on the market here because she's preparing for those similar things. And so it's interesting to have watched them cared for their grandparents. Now I'm watching my mother care for him. Mm-hmm. And, but there's no guarantee that she won't go first. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is I think there's a lot of families, and I think we talked about this the other day with like when you onboard a new employee or you're building out a team, you contract together before anything becomes uncomfortable, right? You kind of hypothetically. Why are families not talking about this when their parents are in their 50s and early 60s? We're not talking about money or the estate, things when everybody is kind of clear-headed, there isn't the emotion involved. There's not the kind of immediacy of the decision. And, thinking back, I would have loved to have had a conversation, with my parents at probably about the age that they would be now, heading towards kind of closer to the 80s. I would have said, okay, what does this look like? No one's moving today. No one needs to move today. Y'all are super able-bodied and bright and engaged. But can we talk about it now while it's not, right on the horizon? And I think that's something that's really important to do. And I think also people don't really see the reality of something when they're in denial. I mean, I'm just moving out for 10 months. Think about closing down these homes that people have lived in for 30, 40 years.
100%.
It is a massive undertaking. And I don't know if you've heard, I'm not going to remember the country, but it's a Nordic country, but it's the idea called death cleaning.
No.
And the idea is you start cleaning and reducing the items in your home as a kindness, as a gift to the next generation.
That's my mother.
When you
Yeah.
do pass, they don't have the burden, and it is a massive burden to close down a home
Yeah. My
and with
mother,
all of
that's
its
literally what we're
goods.
doing.
Yeah, and we
Yeah.
don't live in the size of homes that are, the previous generations did, And so, why aren't we having those conversations now?
Well, and let's talk about the other side because, we did have that conversation in our family and it didn't go
Mhm.
well.
Okay.
We'll talk about that on the other side. It was a difficult conversation. We'll be right back.
You've been listening to Wrong Way Forward, where bad advice goes to die and then gets resurrected just so we can roast it again.
If you're enjoying the chaos, hit like and subscribe and come back every Thursday for new episodes.
Have a new topic or some disastrously bad advice you want to dissect? Email wrongwayforwardpodcast@gmail.com. Include your contact info.
Now back to Wrong Way Forward.
Roasting the worst advice ever. Welcome back to the Katie and Justin podcast.
Welcome back to this week's episode of Wrong Way Forward, where we are talking about aging parents and the right way and wrong way forward. We talked about a column where a woman was watching her mom take some falls in a casino with or without drinks. The father was okay with that because he wants a drinking buddy, we suspect, and how she handled this. And when we left the break, we were talking about difficult conversations to have with family. And Katie was mentioning that families should be having these conversations. And my mom orchestrated a conversation like that with our family, last year. And it was a difficult conversation because, I obviously I don't want to reveal things that happened in it, but it was just when you start talking about finances and, what the care plan is, all of those things, she's looking at it from one standpoint, kids are looking at it from a different standpoint. It was hard. And like you said, maybe it's better to have those conversations many years before you're in the middle of it. But it's hard until you are dealing with that.
Right. And I think, what I found is that, when my mother passed away, my dad had something medical. It was small. I mean, it might have been like a rotator cuff surgery or something, of kind of little consequence. And he didn't tell us because he didn't want to bother us.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all together on vacation, and the 4 kids just ripped into my dad. And he ended up going to bed a little bit earlier, and then he woke up and he came out and he's like, "Are y'all talking about?" He goes, "Y'all talking about me?" And we're like, "Yeah, we are, you asshole." Like, we only have one parent. You've got to be honest with us. Like, you are still in the parent. Yeah, you are still in the parent role, but we need to know if you're going into surgery. We need to know if you need help. Like, that is part of the cycle. That is the reason why you built a good family and good kids and, and people who want to rely on each other. If we're all going to, live in a silo and not help one another, what's the intention of family? And it really took to him. And then he started informing us along the way, but we really had to kind of, put it into kind of terms that he could get beyond this. I don't want to be a burden. I'm the parent. I don't want to bother my children. And to kind of be like, it's actually hurts more and it bothers us more when you don't.
Yeah.
And he was instead in his space, not in the kind of, bigger space. And I think this is a really kind of difficult conversation. And what is happening in this case, which I think also Abby didn't address, is this woman says, "I'm at my wit's end."
Yeah.
And she's getting to the point
Cry for
where
help.
she's in fight or flight. She is not being productive with her parents. And then what she's doing is she's going on and making decisions and purchases and making comments. And she's just trying to grab the bull by the horns because she's so anxious. And so she's like, "I'm going to purchase it without their agreement or consent." And so what she's got to do is get out of that space or she's never going to be productive with her parents.
100%. And, it brings up some other thoughts on, again, because this is an ongoing thing with my family, I'm careful about what I'm saying. But there were 2 things that were interesting because, my parents split time between Florida and Colorado. My mom is moving their life back here. So we are doing the go over to their house thing when they get back here in April to pick anything you want. Everything else is gone. So we're doing that, but she's moving their life to Florida because that's the home they know. But there was tension because we live here and so it's hard to reconcile those 2 things, and so we're going to have to make a much bigger effort to get there to see them and all of that kind of stuff. But it does feel isolating, I would say, and that was part of the conversation. And the other thing on the finances, like we're an open book, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to come over and go through your books. That's not comfortable for me, and So there's just a lot of awkward conversations that are really dealing with death. And that's hard when you're dealing with a parent.
I think it's hard because you're like, you're leaving me, I'm here. The
Yeah.
reframe is you are in your later years, you are going to be more comfortable at
Yes.
ease there. So it is their decision.
And
You
we
know what, Justin?
understand that.
Yeah. You know what I think is really interesting, and I'm probably going to butcher this, but I read this article in the New York Times years ago, and it really, really stuck with me. And it was talking about like how as you kind of get older, the sense of time goes away. So when you're up to age 18, if you don't go away for like boarding school, you live in the house with your parents. You see them all the time, right? And then in college, you see them, maybe even in the full summer, but you see them maybe 4 weeks, 5 weeks. But as you get older, and the guy gave this example, he goes, I see my parents on average, maybe not even 2 weeks a year. And he said, thinking that I'm 60 and my parents are 85, if I do the math and my parents live till 90, I'm only going to see them for about 3 more months for the rest of my life.
Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy. But then if you do the math, and he said, it's one of those things. Like, he's like, I live in New York and I love to go to the Met. I only go to the Met one time a year. But now at age 60, I'm like, if I live to 85, I am only going to go to the Met 25 more times. That might motivate me to go more frequently. And so when you said that, it made me think, do the math, and numbers diminish, as you get older because time gets crunched. Is like, how much time do you want to spend with your parents? And sometimes it's harder to spend time with older parents. I mean, I remember sometimes like going and seeing my grandmother who was in her 90s. And I'm like, what the hell are we going to talk about for like a full day? It was a lot of work. It was very exhausting. As you get old, you get into a certain routine. And so sometimes it's hard to go visit because it's not the lively trip y'all used to take or this or that.
She's not going to make you a steak dinner. You're going to sit around and laugh and have wine.
Yeah, exactly. And like, they're going to bed earlier and they're not drinking as much. And, and so sometimes they get more conservative, you name it. Different things happen as people age. I think it's also having a really frank discussion within your own family unit as, okay, with the diminishing returns on time, what does that look like? And what do we want to agree to? And how do we want to spend that time? And how do we make the time most productive? So I have some friends who are like, I'm going to go visit my parents very frequently, but I can't stay more than 4 days because I go crazy. And and I think really thinking of that ahead of time is important to kind of set in that routine and make that commitment to see your parents.
Well, even like, my grandmother is in a home, and my brother, because we've talked about this before, he was always the grandparents' favorite. He's been down there like 16 times. He flies down and drives up. It's like this huge thing. And I have not been down there once, and I have guilt over that. But
well, you should.
Well, thank you. And that's this week's episode of Wrong Way Forward. That sums up Wrong Way Forward for 30 seasons, 30 episodes.
Justin, do you want to just go once?
I do, but this is going to sound awful. No, I can't say that.
I know exactly what you're saying, and I know exactly what you're feeling, but it's like you're also having the guilt. And
I am having guilt.
Yeah.
It's not because of me. I mean, my parents moved us out of Colorado when I was 5. I never knew her, but I'm having guilt because that's my father's mother, not because of the relationship I don't have with her. Right. I would hate if I had a child for them to be like, well, you don't care about I would be thinking you don't care about my mom. That's where I have guilt. But I feel like that ship has sailed. I don't know.
I think maybe like, what's the way to reframe that is like, yeah, it's kind of a pain in the ass to get there. It's a lot of work. I think back to particularly older people who are in homes, the concept of mattering, like one visit, like for you, like, I come out there one visit, you're like, oh, it's fun to have Katie. Like for them, it has so much meaning. Does that help at all?
It created my shoulders just. TSA lines are so long right now. I'm just kidding.
This is what we call in coaching when you get to the action and accountability place. You generally want someone to take action and then kind of how are they going to hold themselves accountable on the action. And people can get really squishy here. Like,
Yeah,
but you know,
I'm squishing and sweating like a son of a
you are
bitch.
like TSA lines, and it's like, oh, I got to run a car, and it's like the price of fuel. I mean, it's like you are doing the classic like dodging and squishiness.
But yeah, I am. And you know, I will say this, and this is the selfish part of me, as I get older, like the time I leave my home, the comfort of my home and my two lovely animals and my husband is precious to me. And so yeah, it's a balancing thing. And so
I know, I totally
I
get it.
I'm a disgusting person. All right.
Well, how about in the next block we do something lighter?
Oh, like we were talking about doing Savannah Guthrie's mother being kidnapped. That sounds great. We'll be back right after this. Thanks for streaming Wrong Way Forward, the weekly reminder that advice is usually free for a reason. We call out bad advice wherever it hides: boardrooms, break rooms, and even book clubs.
Enjoying this dumpster fire? Like, subscribe, and check back every Thursday for new episodes. Want us to roast your favorite piece of nonsense? Email us at wrongwayforwardpodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to include your contact info. We're not psychic, just judgmental. And now, back to Wrong Way Forward.
Roasting the worst advice ever. Welcome back to the Katie and Justin.
Coming out, we were talking about whether we should talk about something lighter. And then this has been bothering me that I've wanted to talk about this for 30 episodes and Katie just has no interest in it.
That's not true. But why don't you tell our listeners what you are so desperate to talk about?
I want to talk about this Savannah Guthrie, this crazy person, the person that I see in my dreams now because they showed us a stupid video of him going up to the door, this crazy masked person. Mm-hmm. The fact that he would go into someone's house and kidnap and what is she, 84-year-old woman.
Yeah.
So on the news recently, Savannah Guthrie did her first interview. And of course I was gripped by it. And they asked her, what was that call like when you got it? And she said, I had been taking the boys out. She lives in New York. I was taking the boys out. I had just gotten home. Mike, her husband, had just gotten home from a golf trip. Kids were running around. They were thinking about dinner and the phone rang and it was her sister. Did you see this interview, Katie?
I haven't. I've seen little snippets.
Yeah, they said it was her sister and the sister was crying and said, Mom's gone. And Savannah said, well, what do you mean Mom's gone? And she said, she's not here. And Savannah, so they talked and she said, well, call 911. And she said, we have called 911. Everyone's here at the house. She's not here. And she said the doors were propped open. And so they assumed that there was a paramedic who came in and took her out. And just hearing the horror, and this resonated with me so much. She says all she can do is wake up in the middle of the night and think of her mother opening her eyes and seeing that crazy man standing over her and how terrifying that would be. And then she has guilt that, because this was her. Yeah. And so,
I mean, 2 comments. When both of my parents died, I was pretty obsessed with what did they feel while it happened. So like when my mom was hit by the car and she went in the air and then landed on her head, like, was she scared, or when my dad was, in the plane and it was going down, like, was he scared? And I was
Did he know? Yeah.
And I was so obsessed with them having their last moments on earth, having fear. I didn't want them to have fear. And again, we don't know what death is like, right? Mm-hmm. And they were both big people of faith. And so, who knows what happens. So
there are a lot of parallels.
So I understand that stress. The other thing where my heart really, really goes out to her, and this is not perfectly analogous, but I have worked with people who know they're going to lose their job. They don't know when, they don't know how, but they know it's coming. And they have found it is sitting in the gray, sitting in that ambiguity is so exhausting. And then they would finally get the, redundancy package or they would finally get the notice and they would say, I just feel such relief because I know what I'm doing now. And it made me think about Savannah. And again, of course, she does not want to know that her mother has passed, but that horrific feeling of not knowing. It is that ambiguity, that grayness, that unknown. It can literally eat you away. And so my heart just goes out to her for everything, but just sitting in that space is so traumatizing, exhausting, and overwhelming. And that's where my heart just breaks for her and her family.
On that note, the other part of the interview they asked her about was, she's a big woman of faith. I didn't even know that. I know that only because I've been watching so much coverage, and that's been a big part of the coverage. Is the mom was a big woman of faith. Savannah wrote a book on faith, all of that, and so that's been a huge part of her journey here. And she said all she's done is pray, because like you, she wanted peace. She wanted to know where they're at, and she said she believes the voice of God spoke to her one night. She was praying, "Where is she? What's going on?" And she heard a voice say, "She's with me." And she said, I don't know whether that means she's with her on the earth somewhere. I assume it means she's within heaven, but it sounded like that brought her some peace. How did you find peace to figure out what you were going through, to answer that question of fear?
I mean, I think it just, for me, somewhat faith, but I think also, spending time with loved ones, knowing the impact my parents had on earth, knowing what good they did. A few people said things to me, and I mean, we can talk about, this in kind of a future episode, because I know a lot of people are experiencing terrible loss, but, a few things people would say things like, your mama raised you to be able to handle this, or someone told me this one time, and people, I'm sure listening are gonna be like, that's really cheesy. And somebody said, God always takes the good ones early. And that's kind of cheesy, but it just really kind of resonated with me. But it takes time. And I have a few friends who've had significant losses lately, and it will always hurt. It's just not as deep and intense. But there are still moments when I just really, really miss them, and particular things like, right now I'm working with a lot of physicians, and I would just like, and I'm building out this course, and I want to do this kind of facilitated thing, and I'm thinking about pulling something from The Pit, and I don't know, I love The Pit on HBO, and pulling out, I'm like, I would just love to have my dad as a doctor to talk through and say, what does this look like if I use this as a scenario? And he would be so excited and so interested.
Yeah.
And, and I think about, those kind of things, but you start to have a reframe where you have those moments and it makes you cry. And then they eventually evolve into moments where I'm like, I'm so grateful I had that kind of relationship with my father where we could talk about that, and that he was intellectually curious and he was interested in what I do, and how grateful I am for that. So, but really.
And our podcast. He would have loved our podcast. We could wrap up by the last time I saw Katie's father, we were in a bar in New Orleans, and I cried to him.
You did. And my dad thought it was very strange, but he still really loved you, because he still remembers you coming to our house, and we were sitting out by the pool having drinks, and you were just reading a John Grisham book, and he goes, well, that guy sure just does make himself at home.
I cried to him because Katie had spent 5 years overseas, and I was like, why did you let her go? I had too much to drink. Anyway.
You did. You also said from that
I was not going to say this.
You said that line from Sex and City. You said something like, I think you said to Nikki, let's go get our girl.
That's right. All right. Well, on that note, we always try and keep this light and fun. And so this last C block took a turn, but it was a good turn. And so as always, we thank you everybody for listening. You can text us your thoughts on this show or any of our episodes at 720-251-4450, 720-251-4450. And Katie, you take us out.
Yeah. And please also, we love to hear from you by email. That's wrongwayforwardpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on all of our social media. And if you want to see our video, you can check us out on YouTube. We'll see you next week.
All right, that's a wrap on this week's episode of Wrong Way Forward. Remember, the only thing worse than taking bad advice is giving it.
If you've liked what you've heard, like, subscribe, or follow us wherever you stream podcasts. And if you've got a topic or need some advice we'll probably regret giving, email us at wrongwayforwardpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Wrong Way Forward.